Hello, my name is Brent Tarter. I'm one of the curators of We Demand, Woman Suffrage in Virginia, the major exhibition at the Library of Virginia to commemorate the centennial of woman suffrage in 1920. I'm also one of the authors of a new book, The Campaign for Woman Suffrage in Virginia, that tells the story. This box of index cards is part of the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia records that are preserved here in the Library of Virginia. The Equal Suffrage League was founded late in 1909, Virginia women who wanted to persuade the General Assembly to propose a woman suffrage amendment to the Constitution of Virginia. They prepared these cards in 1919, about the time that Congress submitted the proposed 19th Amendment to the states for ratification or rejection. This was part of their lobbying campaign for the 1920 regular session of the Assembly that was to consider the amendment. These cards contain information about members of the House of Delegates in 1919. It's a wonderful collection of information. The Equal Suffrage League lobbyists and volunteers collected this information so that they would know who was so opposed that there was no point in wasting your time talking to them, who was a firm supporter who could help you persuade other members, and also to collect information from the districts back home about people who might work on the undecided members, because there were people who were opposed who were changing their minds. There were people who had not committed themselves. Some of them are identified on the cards as turnable. They were persuadable. This is a very sophisticated database for the time. We don't know that anybody in Virginia ever did something like this before. We know very little about citizen lobbying before 1920. Citizens did often sign petitions and send to the legislature advocating or opposing certain measures of public policy. They'd been doing this since early in the colonial period. This, however, may be new. We do know that national woman suffrage activists in Washington compiled cards like this on members of Congress when they were trying to get Congress to submit the amendment to the states. But this is new for Virginia, I think. This indicates a level of sophistication that is pretty remarkable. Some of these cards contain wonderfully interesting information. The card for Richard Lewis Brewer of Suffolk is especially interesting, in part because Brewer was elected Speaker of the House of Delegates in January 1920. That means he was already a very influential member in 1919. Brewer was also sympathetic to woman suffrage by 1920. And the most remarkable thing about his card is that it records the results of a conversation that he had with Richmond artist Adele Clark, who was one of the most active and effective of all of the volunteer suffragists in Virginia. She met with him late in the year, and he actually offered advice on legislative strategy for the ratification session. He suggested to Clark that they arrange to have the resolution of ratification introduced in the Senate first. He thought it had a better chance to pass the Senate than to pass the House of Delegates. And he also believed that if it passed the Senate, that would improve the chance that it would pass the House of Delegates. Now, there were a great many Virginia politicians who opposed the 19th Amendment, some of them because they opposed woman suffrage generally. There were others, however, who approved woman suffrage or were undecided about woman suffrage, who opposed the 19th Amendment because the 19th Amendment would grant the federal government power to enforce votes for women, with exactly the same language that the 15th Amendment of 1870 had granted the federal government power to protect African American voting. Those undecided people, those suffragists who opposed the 19th Amendment, feared that if the federal government had that authority, it would interfere with Virginia election laws and election practices and undo the disfranchisement of African Americans that they had completed only just a few years earlier in Virginia and in all of the other states of the former Confederacy. Brewer went further in his suggestions to Adele Clark and said, "Why don't you introduce an amendment to the state constitution to grant women the suffrage? Well, they had tried that before. They had been doing that for a decade and had given up because they couldn't persuade the General Assembly to do it. They now had an opportunity with the 19th Amendment, so Clark said it's too late. Nevertheless, what Brewer suggested actually came to pass. Early in the legislative session in 1920, both houses of the General Assembly, by large margins, rejected the 19th Amendment. But in March 1920, both houses, by large margins, proposed an amendment to the state constitution to grant women the right to vote. Of course, ratification of the 19th Amendment in August 1920 made an amendment of the state constitution unnecessary, so the General Assembly never took the next steps to amend the state constitution. But what's important here, this is very important and almost nobody knows this, woman suffragists in Virginia actually persuaded the all-white, all-male General Assembly to propose a woman suffrage amendment to the state constitution. The suffragists came close to achieving their original objective. It was too late to make any practical difference, but they were more successful than we had ever thought. They deserve a lot more credit than they have ever been given. When the Library of Virginia reopens to the public in full, we hope that you will come and see our exhibition. In the meantime, or even afterwards, you can look at exhibition materials online at this website, edu.lvavirginia.gov/we demand.